In this series, we're going to go over the ban list and explain why cards are banned, and if the cards on the ban list could come off the ban list. This time, we'll be taking a look at the newest competitive paper format, Pioneer, which includes every standard set after Return to Ravnica. This leaves the format in a powerful state, but much weaker than Modern or Legacy, leaving it with one of the most unique ban lists we've seen so far. We'll be starting off with the first cards banned in the format, the Fetchlands. These are a cycle of lands that you can tap, pay 1 life, and sacrifice to search your deck for a land with one of the 2 basic land types and put it onto the battlefield. Importantly, this doesn't only find basics, but non-basic lands as well. Before we get to why these cards are banned, we should explain some of the background of this banning. Unlike with Modern, Wizards didn't launch the format with an extensive list of pre-banned cards. The only cards banned in the inception of Pioneer were these Fetchlands. Wizards then had weekly bannings for the first several months of the format, essentially creating the pre-ban list based on what was dominant in the early days of the format. So why did Wizards deem the Fetchlands the only cards worth banning right out the gate? To put it simply, Fetchlands are the best color-fixing lands Wizards has ever printed, and yes, that includes the OG dual lands from Alpha. Basically, with clever deck building, you can make it so that your Fetchlands can find any color of mana in your deck. This is thanks to the existence of lands like the OG duals and the Shocklands, which have 2 land types. If you have, for example, a Bloodstained Mire, you can find a Blood Crypt, a Godless Shrine, an Overgrowth Tomb, a Sacred Foundry, a Steam Vents, a Stomping Ground, or a Watery Grave, because all of these lands are either a swamp or a mountain. Among these 7 lands, all 5 colors of the game are represented. Being able to find any color you need in any situation and getting a dual land on top of that makes mana bases incredibly flexible and powerful, thanks entirely to these Fetchlands. This is so strong that mana bases in formats like Modern lean heavily onto the Fetchlands to fix their colors, especially 3, 4, and 5 color decks. This isn't even where the power of Fetchlands stop, however. They can find monocolor lands with land types such as Mystic Sanctuary, and interaction so powerful it's part of why Sanctuary is banned in Modern. It also makes things like the Triomes even more powerful, as you can fetch them out on a turn where you don't need mana and essentially fix your mana instantly. The thing is, as strong as this is, it's not necessarily broken. It is, however, format defining. So much of how formats like Modern and Legacy are played is based heavily off of having fetch lands in your mana base. For example, players effectively have lower life totals in those formats because everyone is paying life for their fetches all the time. This is even more pronounced in Modern, where people will fetch for a Shockland and pay 3 life on the first turn of the game regularly. This is the majority of the reason why Death Shadow is a playable deck in those formats. It also puts a premium on effects like Brainstorm, as being able to stack the top cards of your decks is made even more powerful by having so many shuffle effects available. There's also the fact that Pioneer has much worse non-basic land hate than other formats, as there aren't any blowout cards like Blood Moon or Back to Basics. So 4 and 5 color decks using fetches to fix their mana would be extremely difficult to punish. It would also make cards that care about lands being in your graveyard extremely powerful, such as cards with the Delve mechanic and Deathrite Shaman. If the Fetchlands were legal, a lot of Delve cards and Deathrite would need to be banned, as they are in Modern and Legacy specifically because of the interaction with fetches filling up your graveyard for free. The end result of allowing the Fetchlands into Pioneer would be a format that plays very similar to Modern in terms of mana bases, but without the few cards that can attempt to keep these strategies in check. It would make the format less unique and make it dominated by 3 and 4 color decks instead of 1 and 2 color decks as it is now, which would largely be negative. Wizards decided the format would be a lot more interesting if Fetchlands weren't allowed, and the fact that they would make the format even more expensive by increasing the demand for Fetchlands. Some of the most heavily played staples in the game also likely played a bit of the role in their decision, though they would never admit that for various legal reasons. So could the Fetchlands be unbanned? Technically, yes, but basically everyone would prefer them to stay banned. The result of unbanning them would be a more expensive format where 3, 4, and 5 color decks run rampant with no punishes. However, worst of all, it would make the format play more like Modern and Legacy, which kinda gets rid of the point of having multiple formats in the first place. It's one of those things where if you unban the card, it wouldn't instantly ruin the format, but it would make it worse for everyone involved. It would also require banning a ton of other cards, so simply wanting a small ban list isn't a good reason to unban them either. So it's overall just better to leave them banned. How could they fix the Fetchlands and unban them in Pioneer? Funnily enough, we already have fixed versions of these cards, some of which are legal in the format. There are the slow fetches, such as Bad River, which can be tapped and sacked to search out a swamp or island, just like Polluted Delta. However, it enters the field tapped, which basically makes it unplayable in any format with good Fetchlands in it. They might see play if they were legal in Pioneer, as Fetchlands are just that powerful, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as warping as the normal fetches are. There's also Fabled Passage, which you can tap and sacrifice to fetch any basic land tapped, but you won't tap it afterwards if you have 4 more lands. This card is legal in Pioneer and has seen a modest amount of play in the format, mostly in slower 3 to 5 color decks that appreciate the extra mana fixing on turn 4. Now, Passage is much weaker than the original Fetchlands, but that's completely fine considering we're comparing it to the absolute best lands ever printed. Making the card any better would likely be overkill. Next up, we have Felidar Guardian. This is a 1/4 cat beast with a mana cost of 3 and 1 white. It is the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you exile another target permanent you control, then return it to the battlefield. This was banned in the first week of Pioneer in November 2019. Why was Felidar Guardian banned? Guardian has a very infamous interaction with the card Saheeli Rai. This is a 3-mana planeswalker with 3 abilities, but the -2 is all that we care about right now. This ability creates a token that's a copy of a target artifact or creature you control, except it's also an artifact if it wasn't already. The token gains haste and you exile it at the end of turn. This ability, you may notice, is eerily similar to Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker, a card infamous for going infinite, and Felidar Guardian interacted with it perfectly. By copying a Guardian, you would get another Guardian trigger. This would allow you to flicker any of your cards, including your Saheeli Rai. If you flicker a Planeswalker, it not only re-enters with normal loyalty, it also resets the once per turn clause that all Planeswalker abilities share. This means you can make another copy of Guardian, which will let you flicker it again, which will let you make another token, and so on and so forth until you have a lethal attack. Basically, this means that if you have both Guardian and Saheeli on the field, you just win the game. This was an incredible win condition. It meant that having either Guardian or Saheeli on the field was essentially representing lethal and demanded an immediate answer. This quickly proved to be extremely problematic, as it made slower decks have to keep up interaction on turn 4 onwards, limiting the types of decks that could exist in the format. As a result, Wizards banned the card to allow slower decks to have more space to breathe. Could Felidar Guardian be unbanned? This is another technical yes, but there's no good reason to unban the card. The format has gotten a lot stronger over time, and there are other combo decks in the format that are around as powerful as Crazy Cat Lady was. In particular, Amalia combo has proven itself to be very strong. The combo involves getting Amalia and Wildgrowth Walker onto the field, and then either gaining life or using the Explorer mechanic. This will result in an infinite loop that ends with Amalia being a 20/20 and destroying all of the creatures on the field. There are a ton of upsides and downsides when comparing these two combos. On the side of Amalia, it is a lot cheaper and has many tutors that allow you to find the pieces of the combo. Crazy Cat Lady, on the other hand, is a true 2-card combo and gets around Summoning Sickness thanks to haste. At the end of the day, Amalia combo is probably slightly stronger just thanks to being reliant on cheaper cards though. So what's the problem? Well, Crazy Cat Lady would still be a viable combo deck, meaning that people would have to keep it in their radar. And you know what's harder to deal with than one powerful combo deck? 3 powerful combo decks. Because Lotus Field combo is also a thing and very hard to stop. The more combo decks are viable in a format, the further sideboard slots will be stretched to deal with them, not to mention all the other threats in the format you have to prepare for as well. Combo decks require the most specific cards and play styles to interact, so having more combo decks that just win the game out of nowhere would make the format a lot more difficult to play, even if the deck itself wouldn't be better than the best combo decks in the format. It's another card that the format is better off without, even if it wouldn't instantly break anything. How could Felidar Guardian be fixed to be unbanned? You could easily make it so that it can't flicker Saheeli anymore, but at that point the card would be completely dead because the combo is all it has going for it. Making the card 6 mana is probably the best you can do without killing the combo entirely. At that point, the card is completely fine. The combo would be so slow that it wouldn't really be viable anymore. You'd be a lot better off just using a normal win condition in your control deck. Next, we have Leyline of Abundance. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green. It is ability where, if it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield. If you tap a creature for mana, you can add an additional green. And finally, it lets you pay 6 and 2 green to put a +1/+1 counter on all of your creatures. It was banned at the same time as Guardian in November of 2019. Now, why was Leyline of Abundance banned? During the early days of Pioneer, one of the best decks was Nykthos Ramp. This deck was able to make disgusting amounts of mana with a combination of mana dorks and their namesake card, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Nykthos was a legendary land that could be tapped for 1, or let you pay 2 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color you wanted for each mana symbol in the mana cost of all permanents you control. So if you had a ton of green cards in play, Nykthos could quickly start producing 5, 6, even 7 mana for only 3. This led into the deck's game plan nicely. Just playing giant guys. You would spend the first several turns ramping, and then slam huge threats into play starting as early as turn 3 with a crazy enough draw. Leyline of Abundance made both of your main sources of ramp even better. The deck played an effective 8 copies of Llanowar Elves thanks to Elvish Mystic being around. So they were playing an elf that tapped for 1 green basically every turn 1. With a single Leyline, this will let you tap elves for 2 green, doubling the amount of ramp they gave you. It also did add up your devotion to green by 2, so every Leyline you had on board let your Nykthos make 2 more mana. This could lead to some truly unbelievable turns. Here's a scenario for you. You open 3 Leylines, a forest, an elf, and a Nykthos. You cheat 3 Leylines onto turn 1, play a land, then play an elf. Turn 2, you play Nykthos, tap your elf for 4 mana, activate Nykthos for 7 mana, then tap your forest for another green, giving you 10 mana on turn 2. At that point, if you have anything to cast, you have a good chance of just winning on the spot if your opponent doesn't have removal. This is obviously an extreme case, but drawing a single Leyline would allow the deck to make huge plays as early as turn 3, and getting more than one was completely disgusting. This isn't even mentioning the power that the activated abilities give you in the late game, letting you turn any board into a threat over a few turns. Mono green ramp was so explosive and powerful that most fair strategies simply couldn't compete. Wizards banned the card to weaken Nykthos ramp without outright killing the card, and it was largely successful. Could Leyline of Abundance be unbanned? This is another soft no. Nykthos is still viable and running around in Pioneer, and it would still get a lot of use out of Leyline of Abundance. The deck doesn't really need Abundance back, especially because it's such a swingy card. Leylines are always really frustrating to play and play against, as the difference between opening a Leyline and drawing it afterwards is massive. They're incredibly swingy and encourages aggressive mulliganing, which makes games even more sacky. Now, some would point to a new Leyline as a reason why Leyline of Abundance could be unbanned, Leyline of the Guild Pack. This is another enchantment with a Leyline ability, letting you start the game with it in play if you open it. Its abilities are, in this context, useless. It's mostly used in Nykthos for its mana cost, which technically increases your devotion to green by 4 thanks to its weird hybrid mana cost. This means it actually gives more mana than Leyline of Abundance does with Nykthos. However, it doesn't do anything with your 8 mana dorks. So while it is better with the best card in your deck, Leyline of Abundance would, overall, be a lot stronger. Basically, the existence of Leyline of the Guild Pack isn't a reason to unban Abundance. It's probably best if Nykthos ramp continues to grow more powerful by getting better spells it actually casts instead of cheating out Leylines. Now, how could Leyline of Abundance be fixed to be unbanned? Really, just remove the Leyline mechanic entirely. Leylines are, whenever they're viable, one of the most frustrating mechanics in the game. Decks that use Leylines as a key part of their strategy are always dependent on good mulligans to be powerful, which no one would call good gameplay. Abundance's abilities are actually quite bad for their mana cost. At 3 mana, it would be completely fair if you didn't get it for free half the time. Next up, we have Veil of Summer. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 green. It draws you a card if your opponent casts a blue or black spell this turn, and it makes it so that for the rest of the turn, your spells can't be countered, and you and all permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and black until end of turn, meaning they can't be targeted by blue or black spells or abilities. This card was banned on the second week of November of 2019. Why was Veil of Summer banned? Mostly because it stopped any blue/black decks from playing Magic for a turn. Veil was meant to protect your plays against those pesky blue and black players and all their interaction, which alone isn't much of an issue. Lots of cards like Autumn's Veil have had very similar effects in the past and are often not good enough to actually see play. Veil of Summer, however, ramps up every dial of this kind of effect all the way up to 11. Veil of Summer didn't just protect your cards. It punished your opponent for even daring to remove your creatures. Protection spells are usually a tempo blowout that rewards being ahead on board. If your opponent uses 2 or 3 mana playing a removal spell, and you only use 1 mana to stop the removal spell, you're up a lot of mana in that exchange. Not to mention that if your creature is important enough to your board state, you'd be willing to pay any amount of mana to keep it alive. This makes these spells powerful, but a bit niche in their application. Veil of Summer, on the other hand, is so broad in what it does and so powerful when it resolves that it warps all these interactions. Rather than just protect your creatures like the other versions of the effect, it protects all of your permanents and you, meaning it can also be used to stop discard spells that target, such as Thoughtseize. This means it gets around one of the big issues that Autumn's Veil had, namely that it wasn't alive often enough to be worth playing. Even worse though, Veil of Summer 2-for-1s your opponent if they cast removal into it. Not only do you keep your creature, you get a card back and they lose their removal. This is such a blowout that, if you're a blue-black deck, you just can't cast anything Veil of Summer could stop without an answer to Veil. The combination of being down an entire card, your removal spell not working, and any other interaction in your hand being worthless for a turn would effectively end the game in the right board state. As a result, you have to either already be so ahead that you can handle getting veiled, play around it with counter magic, or wait for your opponent to tap out. Players often joke that Veil of Summer was a 1-mana Cryptic command in that matchup, which is a bit of an exaggeration because Cryptic's biggest upside is its versatility. But it often is effectively a counterspell and a draw for 1 mana. This made matchups between green and blue-black decks so lopsided that Wizards had to ban the card. Could Veil of Summer be unbanned? No. Veil of Summer is strong enough to see sideboard played in Modern, Legacy, and even Vintage to protect your plays against interaction. And in all of those formats, the blue-black players have better answers to Veil. Green decks already have access to cards like Blossoming Defense to fill a similar role to Veil, so it's not like it's a major weakness in the color's card pool. Leaving it banned mostly keeps both decks on similar footing in terms of interactions in these matchups, as opposed to when Veil was legal and blue-black decks were bringing a knife to a gunfight. How could Veil of Summer be fixed to be unbanned? It's very simple. Remove the draw clause. The biggest pain point of the card is getting 2 for 1 on a key interaction spell and being so far behind you can't recover. Veil being able to protect you from Thoughtseize and the like is incredibly strong, but it wouldn't be backbreaking if you weren't getting punished for even trying to interact with your opponent. It would work similar to cards like Spell Pierce, only with a different set of circumstances where it works, which is perfectly fine. Next up, we have Field of the Dead. This is a land that enters the field tapped and can be tapped to add 1 colorless mana. The important ability is that, whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, while you control 7 or more lands with different names, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This card was banned in the first week of December of 2019. Why was Field of the Dead banned? Field of the Dead's power level was vastly underestimated on release. Most players thought it would be incredibly difficult to get 7 lands with different names in play, but it quickly proved to be absolutely broken. Green has access to a ton of cards like Elvish Rejuvenator and Hour of Promise that could ramp out non-basic lands and play a ton of lands with different names, which was a non-issue. As a result, land-based ramp decks get Field of the Dead out and start making bodies as early as turn 4 or 5, at which point you were in serious trouble. Ramp decks are already very difficult to stop once they get out their giant threats, but it is possible if you have a good position in the game beforehand. However, Field of the Dead completely changes that. Even if you answer whatever big threats your opponent casts, if they're making a ton of zombies turn after turn, you'll eventually be overrun by the horde. You could try to remove Field of the Dead with a card like Field of Ruin, but your opponent will have already made some zombies by then, and that's not answering any of the powerful, high mana value spells they're casting. Essentially, it was a must-kill card that decks could use for free while also playing all their actual threats that you also had to stop right away. As a result, the only real way to beat Field of Ruin is to kill your opponent before they can get it rolling. This is very rarely a real option for most decks. Unless you're playing an aggro deck or a combo deck, the Field of the Dead player will be able to get to 7 lands before you can end the game. Field of the Dead, alongside their high-impact spells like Ugin the Spirit Dragon, are almost impossible to deal with at the same time. Field of the Dead made every game that went long go from difficult to essentially impossible to win. Thanks to the tide of insurmountable advantage it could generate, Wizards banned the card. Could Field of the Dead be unbanned? No. For reference, Field of the Dead is still banned in Modern, a much more powerful format than Pioneer, for largely the same reasons. Now, Modern does have a lot of cards that enable Field of the Dead that Pioneer doesn't have, such as Primeval Titan, but Pioneer does have more than enough cards that cheat out lands, such as Arboreal Grazer, to enable Field of the Dead. Not to mention any cards that work with non-basic lands in the future. And Modern also has more answers to the card. Regardless of this comparison, Field of the Dead remains a difficult card to answer that makes any deck that can use it almost unbeatable in the late game. The only decks that can compete with ramp decks with Field of the Dead are aggro and combo decks, a relatively small portion of the metagame. It's much healthier for the format for the card to stay banned. How could Field of the Dead be fixed to be unbanned? It's pretty impossible to fix because the very premise of the card is kinda broken. A land that makes creatures whenever you play a land is, by its very nature, very exploitable. The thing is, the cards that you want to play with Field of the Dead, namely cards that let you cheat out non-basic lands, can also grab and cheat Field of the Dead into play. The restriction to needing 7 lands of different names is too lax, considering how many good lands there are to play. But upping the number of lands you need would quickly make the card unplayable. The best solution would be to make a card you actually have to spend mana on as opposed to being free, such as an enchantment. Zendikar's Royal makes a 2/2 whenever you play a land and is quite bad at 5 mana. So if you put this exact effect on 2 or 3 mana enchantment, it would probably be fine. And finally, we have Once Upon a Time. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It is the effect where you reveal the top 5 cards of your library, then put a land or creature card from among them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library. This could also be cast for free if it was the first spell you cast that game. This was banned at the same time as Field of the Dead in the second week in December of 2019. Now, why was Once Upon a Time banned? We've talked about this card a few times, as it's also banned in Modern. The issue with this card is very simple. It's a bit too good at letting green decks find their cards. Even if Once Upon a Time could never be cast for free, it would still be a reasonable spell to play. The fact that it's free means that green decks are able to find their early plays essentially every game. The first Once Upon a Time you played was, well, it was basically a Yu-Gi-Oh! Spell card or a Pokemon item card. And there's a reason those games don't print cards like this. They're simply too good at letting you rip through your deck for whatever pieces you need. Beyond giving one color a free advantage, it also made any sort of linear green decks a lot better. For example, any ramp or combo decks. Considering that the early days of Pioneer were dominated by various shades of linear green ramp decks, you can see why people were tired of this card. Once Upon a Time had also shown that, in any format where it was even remotely castable, some decks would find a way to abuse it to make their combos way too consistent. Even though its main homes had already been banned out from under it, Wizards wanted to let Nykthos ramp continue to be a thing, and it would definitely be broken in that deck someday. Wizards decided that someday was far too soon and sent the card out to pastures before it could become a thorn in their side once again. Now, could Once Upon a Time be unbanned now? No. Nykthos Ramp is still a playable deck, and it would make it far too consistent. Not to mention, it's a card that's sort of a ticking time bomb. As soon as a green deck becomes the best deck in the format, Once Upon a Time will make it really hard to beat thanks to the extra consistency it provides to the strategy. The only time Once Upon a Time is okay is in a format where it's effectively unusable if it isn't free, and the only format where a 2-mana cantrip like this isn't at least okay are Legacy and Vintage. Everywhere else, it's basically only a matter of time before it eats a ban. How could you fix Once Upon a Time so it could be unbanned? Making it so that the free cast condition instead lets you cast it for only 1 mana would fix it, but also kill the card. At the same time, letting it be free and dig through a reasonable number of cards would be too good. The card design is ultimately just far too polarizing to land at a spot where it's not broken, but still worth playing. The 1 mana to cast mode is probably the best compromise, but it's still quite the compromise.